So I am Ronnie. I'm part of this small team called the API Academy. We're a group within CA Technologies. CA has a booth outside if you're interested in API management products, that kind of thing. But this particular group, the API Academy, we don't really sell products. What we do is primarily research. We research a lot. We do writing. We do these kinds of talks. We listen a lot, primarily in the API space. You're going to hear a lot of talks over the next few days about kind of the intricacies, the implementation details of things like microservices, right? But I wanted to spend just 20 minutes with you talking about the people side of all of this. And a few of you know me, and if you know me, you know I hate people. But it fascinates me at the same time, right? This idea of how we work together to create something. For a long time, I was kind of fascinated by the user side of that, how we make products that are user-centric, right? Because they're built with empathy for the people who use them. The thing about microservices is taking us to this place where we become empathetic towards the people who build products as well. In the design space, they have these ideas of service design and things like that that captures it. I also like microservices, and I think a lot of us do. I kind of like it because I rallied against it for a while, this idea of micro, of small. I would tell people small is not the point. But I'm starting to think maybe small is the point. Because small is easy to understand, right? If I tell you this is what a microservice is, it's this small thing, we might not agree on what small is, but you can start with that. And what amazes me is you start with that and it takes you somewhere. It takes you to this kind of way of building software that's been 15 or 20 years in the making. Right? You start with small services, and you quickly realize to make all those small services talk to each other, you need to think about architecture. So you start trying to solve these coordination problems in architecture. And you'll end up finding that there's these amazing processes and tools you can use to support that architecture. So you start concerning yourself with that side as well. If you look at what people are discussing in the microservices space, I can't remember the last time I saw anyone talk about the service itself. We barely talk about the micro part. We barely talk about the interfaces. Now we talk about how to deploy these things, how to get them to talk to each other, how to operationalize them, how to look at logging. This is a diagram that's meant to show that all of this stuff is interconnected. Right? So as we start to go small, we end up doing these other things. And the same is true in the opposite direction. As we change the architecture, that has an impact on how we build services and what tools we use. But as I said, I'm kind of interested in this bottom part. Right? This idea that organization and culture are a big part of this whole thing. That how we structure our company, the way we communicate, has an impact on the things that we build. And that's what I'd like to dive into. This is the way it is because of a simple truth. What we build can't change. Right? We know that. So if I write software, that software does what it's supposed to do. I deploy it, it doesn't change. Maybe it has some self-healing capability, some small things, some ability to be more resilient. But we haven't got to the point where the stuff that I deploy can change when our requirements change. Change only happens because people make change happen. That's why we have to care about the people in this whole system. I think we're starting to see that. What we also notice is when we start looking at the person who builds something, we need to look at the people they work with. Right? So this is what most of us are dealing with. We have a system of people where the complexity is distributed because one person can't do it all. And this system is responsible for outputting another system. Most of us focus on that technology part, but what's obvious is it's a result of the original people platform, that system of people working together. What I'm interested in discovering, and by the way, most of what I do is ask questions. I've very rarely have answers. What I'm interested in discovering is how we could program that platform, right? What can we actually change in there to affect change? I strongly believe if you continue with your microservices journey, starting with small but growing to all these other parts of that complex system, eventually you'll figure out what your organization needs to look like. But just like with architecture, where we can learn from where others have done well, we should be able to do that with our people platform as well. And we certainly have examples of that, right? We have stories. Microservices is filled with stories. It always seems like there's just a few companies that keep popping up. The same is true with organizational things as well. There's a few companies that we always hear about. They have some things in common. Their business domains are pretty different, but they all seem to embrace this idea of autonomy. Maybe they use different words for it, but somehow they're saying the people who do the work are able to have authority over what they do. Sometimes it's referred to as freedom, right? Autonomy. I do want to make the point, though, that while these companies might do well, I'll say they're not the only profitable companies in the world, right? So we shouldn't draw this conclusion that this is the only way to run a profitable organization. It's obvious that there are other ways. But there is something interesting about this. The challenge is, though, in my day-to-day work, when I meet people who are trying to change how they build software, they're not quite sure what to do with this stuff. One reaction is to say, it works great there, the story is fascinating, but it wouldn't work here because our business model is different. We have different constraints, a different context. And I kind of have to agree, that is true. It probably wouldn't work exactly the same way. Another reaction is to take one asset, one thing that one of these companies have done and just take it home and try it. I mean, everyone's seen the Netflix culture presentation that Patty McCord developed. A pretty typical thing is to take this great presentation, bring it back, and just show it to everyone, and job done. Well, that doesn't work either. So what I'm interested in understanding is going beyond the surface of the story. What are the elements of what makes autonomy work in these places, right? What can we find if we actually go exploring a bit? One thing that becomes obvious is decisions are hugely important, right? When we talk about autonomy, we're talking about decisions. You make decisions all the time when you're writing code, but you make decisions everywhere when you're talking about microservices architectures. When should services be created? Who should be on a team? What's the scope of a service? What tools are you allowed to use? Right? We need to figure out who decides all these things. So I could roughly draw an organizational chart like this, where I put a group called enterprise architects in a small box nearer the top. We could say as you go closer to the top, you have a strategic view. And we could call the people working here at the bottom of the box the people who are more hands-on. We'll call them service developers in small teams. I think a lot of organizations have something that looks like this. I think the theory is that a lot of us work this way, where the decisions about the architecture and the work we do are primarily centralized in this small team. And we see less decision power in the teams on the outside, right? This is what we're told, and we're told this might be a problem. And the flip side of this is that if we distribute the decisions to the service teams, that things will get easier. What I found when I started digging in is that this is not 100% accurate. There is value in decentralizing decisions, but what I found in practice is that the story is a little bit more nuanced than this. It's not as simple as just taking all the things that enterprise architecture teams do and distributing them. And to understand that, we have to look a little bit at how decisions are actually made. There's a lot of business literature on decisions. For the sake of what we're talking about, I'm using a model from T.T. Patterson. It's referenced in this book by Mintzberg, if you care about citations and where the work comes from. Decisions start with information. So maybe you've gathered information in your career, maybe you've gone and done research, but it starts with figuring out aspects of what you're going to make a decision about. From information, we filter that down to advice. Maybe it's a selection of choices, or maybe it's just things you should do and things you shouldn't do. From that advice, we get a choice. And this is the decision part, right? So I'm given options, and I take one. But the decision doesn't happen unless it's allowed to happen, right? So we can identify a road we want to take, but we don't take the road unless it's allowed. And then finally, we have execution of that decision. We can imagine a scenario where all this happens in one person's mind, right? On some task, I might be able to do the research myself, narrow it down to what should be done, make the decision, authorize myself to do it, and then take on that work. But we can also imagine different teams doing each of these parts. Some of the challenge seems to be when we have lots of teams involved, right? And we have to start crossing boundaries as part of the decision process. So this is the original model. I add to it with this last step of challenge. Challenge is important because we want to be able to evolve, right, and move forward. So decisions should be able to be challenged. So if you buy this breakdown of a decision model, I'll simplify it a bit and I'll use some pictures. Okay, we'll use little icons to represent each of these parts. If we go back to that picture I showed you before, we've got the architects and the developers. Instead of this kind of simplistic model where we just say, these are decisions, we could now explode those bubbles into the little parts, right? So we could say what's actually happening is this centralized team is doing the information gathering, they're making the choice, they're authorized to make the choice, and the other teams are actually doing the work. So that still feels like the centralized model. And I guess I could flip it as well, right? Move all of the circles from the top and put them in the bottom. But when you do a little digging, what you find is the people who are doing microservices work often do something that looks a bit like this, right? They're not at the wholesale distributing all parts of the decision. They might keep some of it centralized. So you can have a centralized enterprise team, for example, that is responsible for doing the information gathering and generating the advice. The service development teams still have autonomy, but now their autonomy is bounded, right? It's within some set. So we can imagine, for example, choosing a programming language for a microservice. In the fully autonomous version, everyone chooses what they want to use. And we're told that's optimized for each service, right? So this is the world we want to be in. But often in reality, what happens is there's some team who decides these are the 3 or 4 languages you're allowed to use. And then developers have autonomy within that set. It helps us balance things like speed and safety, or in some cases, increase them both. I mentioned challenge, and that's an important part of this as well, right? In addition to a centralized team providing a set of choices, we might also want to be able to challenge that. And you have to think of how that might work. It could be that teams are allowed to do things that are not on the menu, but they need to tell everybody, or they need to defend that choice themselves. So this gives us part of the picture, right? It helps us fill in the blanks a little bit and go beyond just the simplistic model of, are we centralized or are we decentralized? But I found that I was still only kind of scraping the edges of what was really going on. Because what would drive you to this model, right? What were the reasons why this might work in your organization or might not? Why might you go fully decentralized versus centralized? And I knew it had something to do with the people involved, but I couldn't quite get my head around it. And then I ended up finding this work. This is a business management book. Came out last year by Menkins and Garden. This is a book whose target audience is, I think, C-level executives, management consultants. They didn't write it for us, I don't think. But it turns out there's lessons in here that are useful for us. This is a book about how to improve work efficiency, which is a subject that probably would scare you, or it scares me. But it turns out that's really what we're talking about here. How do we optimize our work in a way that we improve the quality, but also improve the speed at which it gets delivered? What I liked that they did is they articulate a model. How do you manage time, talent, and energy to improve the productivity of your organization? So we start with this idea of time. Mankins and Garden use this term organizational drag, which is that accidental complexity we introduce. When they talk about it, they're talking about meetings and email, right? People stealing your time because they're calling meetings you don't need to be at. The constant barrage of emails that you get. For us in the microservices world, we have organizational drag we have to deal with as well. Cases where teams can't make autonomous decisions because they need to get blessings or approval from other more centralized parts of the organization, for example. When teams need to coordinate together and we can only move at the speed of that coordination, that can cause organizational drag. I would say this part is the part we know about, or at least it's the part we kind of get our heads nodding about because we've all been there and we understand it. But it's this second concept, talent. That's the one that got my attention because this is the thing that I had worried about. On that other slide, when I showed you those companies that had figured out how to do this, the ones that claim to have more autonomous styles of working, one of the things they seemed to have in common was a talent pool filled with some of the best people in the world. Right? We know from their policies of hiring that they're very selective. Right? You only get to work there if you're very good. That makes it easier to be autonomous, doesn't it? I mean, if I distribute my decisions, then I want the people making decisions to be very good at making decisions, right? At making those decisions, to have the experience to be able to do it, to be able to make less mistakes. But there's one thing that's obvious. If you have better talent, you'll be better off, right? I don't think you can do anything about that. But what I found was in my day-to-day work with people I talked to, when I talked about these other ways of working, the context and constraints they work within is that they have good talent, but they don't have the top 1% in the world, nor do they have the budget to make that happen. And if we think about it, how can we all have the top 1% in the world? Right? So does it mean that the model that we show on the slides of there's a certain way of working will never work for us? Right? It's just this thing to aspire to that will only be for the 1%. Mankins and Garden suggest that's not necessarily the case. What they claim is that it's distribution that matters. They acknowledge that the fight for talent is kind of a zero-sum game, and you're not necessarily going to win that. They also acknowledge that talent is, of course, important. As I said, if we have the best people, we'll be better off. They focus on distribution from a kind of business perspective, that if you know what business you're in, you can distribute talent accordingly. You don't invest in talent for the parts of your business that don't help you, right? So understanding your business is important. I think we can take those lessons and apply it to our systems. And when I say system, I mean that entire circle I showed you. If we can determine which are the most important decisions, the most important activities, those are the places that we want to fuel with talent. So maybe the key here is to gain a better understanding of how our systems work, to be able to prioritize where talent should be placed, right? Where do we need talent the most? Which decisions matter? Which ones have the biggest effects on the system overall? And it turns out that centralized and decentralization aspects matter for that kind of a discussion. And then the last thing which they mention is this idea of energy, which is something we never talk about. And that's essentially leadership. How do you motivate people to work? How do you get them to care about the work that they're producing? When I visited organizations that are doing well with this stuff, they almost always had great leadership, right? People who could keep the ship going, people who could get everyone to embrace the idea of things like constant change. I can't remember the last time I went to a conference like this where anyone even mentioned this, but it turns out to be hugely important. So in my journey of understanding this stuff, these two ideas of breaking down decisions into those individual elements and the time, talent, energy model were useful. I wanted to take it a little bit further, though, and see how that could be applied. So what I'm experimenting with at the moment is some kind of paper tool, some kind of way of just picking away at this complexity. Could we start to better visualize how these types of organizations work? I'm toying with the name activity map at the moment. The basic idea is if we take those elements we talked about, the parts of a decision, can I map those out? Not in the picture way I showed you before, although that's useful, but maybe in a way that's easier to process. So if I take an activity, I'll put it on the left, and I'll identify teams, divisions, or groups, ideally small numbers of people within each team to make this more usable. Could we just start mapping the decision elements onto that? And what could we learn from doing that, right? So to take an example, let's take the activity or the decision of team membership. How do you decide who is on each service team? I could line up a bunch of teams on the top and map out the decision elements, right? One of the things we start to notice is that we can start to identify where we need talent based on two things: where the decision elements are located and the nature of the activity. How important is this activity to our system, right? One of the challenges, though, is we need to know a little bit about kind of the instances of teams. That gives us a hint about centralization, decentralization, and talent investment. So in this fictional case, I've got a development manager. If they have the lion's share of the decision authority, they're essentially doing almost all of it. This is a sign of centralization, right? That we have a single party who drives most of this decision. We know that centralization indicates more control, but it's often harder to scale. So if we're creating lots of teams, if team membership is changing a lot, this is a potential bottleneck. But this doesn't show us if it's an actual bottleneck. And of course, the flip side would be this. If we have many service teams, this might indicate to us a more decentralized distribution. We have less control over the decisions, but it's potentially easier to scale. Also, potentially a bigger talent investment. We can also start to spread this out. We can play with the idea of, human resources teams being able to provide advice and challenge the decisions that service teams make. This speaks to a common thing that comes up. We hear about things like Conway's Law and cross-functional teams, but how big is the team? Who should be on it? Right? Do we have an HR person on every service team? This model gives us a way to address the concerns over control and risk, but still provide some autonomy. And ideally, I'd like to see patterns start to develop, where we start to identify activities that work together to give us behaviors we need. We can give autonomy over service implementation, but we restrict boundaries by controlling the goal of the service, for example. So we centralize some parts and decentralize others. I'm hoping to develop this further, but it's just a tool. There's probably other tools that people are using along the same lines. I'm eager to hear stories, so if you see me over the next 2 days, tell me about how things are working in your organization. Most importantly, I want us to, as an industry, as architects, developers, as technical people, to start to embrace that this organization and culture stuff affects us and can belong to us too. I feel like the traditional model has been, HR getting involved and then managers worrying about headcounts. But a future model could be to start building a people platform that we architect in the same way as we architect our technology systems. Here's my contact information if you want to get in touch, and thank you for your time.